Lyddie by Katherine Paterson. Chapter 10. Oliver. The 4:30 bell clanged the house awake. From every direction, Lyddie could hear the shrill voices of girls calling to one another, even singing. Someone on another floor was imitating a rooster. From the other side of the bed, Betsy groaned and turned over, but Lyddie was up, dressing quickly in the dark as she had always done in the windowless attic of the inn. Her stomach rumbled, but she ignored it. There would be no breakfast until 7, and that was 2.5 hours away. By 5, the girls had crowded through the main gate, jostled their way up the outside staircase on the far end of the mill, cleaned their machines, and stood waiting for the workday to begin. "Not too tired this morning?" Diana asked by way of greeting. Lyddie shook her head. Her feet were sore, but she'd felt tireder after a day behind the plow. "Good. Today will be something more strenuous, I fear. We'll work all 3 looms together, all right, until you feel quite sure of everything." Lyddie felt a bit as though the older girl were whispering in church. It seemed almost that quiet in the great loom room. The only real noise was the creaking from the ceiling of the leather belts that connected the wheels in the weaving room to the gigantic water wheel in the basement. The overseer came in, nodded good morning, and pushed a low wooden stool under a cord dangling from the assembly of wheels and belts above his head. His little red mouth pursed. He stepped up on the stool and pulled out his pocket watch. At the same moment, the bell in the tower above the roof began to ring. He yanked the cord. The wide leather belt above him shifted from a loose to a tight pulley, and suddenly all the 100 or so silent looms in raucous concert shuddered and groaned into fearsome life. Lyddie's first full day as a factory girl had begun. Within 5 minutes, her head felt like a log being split to splinters. She kept shaking it as though she could rid it of the noise, or at least the pain, but both only seemed to grow more intense. If that weren't trial enough, a few hours of standing in her proud new boots, and her feet had swollen so that the laces cut into her flesh. She bent down quickly to loosen them, and when she found the right lace was knotted, she nearly burst into tears. Or perhaps the tears were caused by the swirling dust and lint. Now that she thought of it, she could hardly breathe. The air was so laden with moisture and debris. She snatched a moment to run to the window. She had to get air, but the window was nailed shut against the April morning. She leaned her forehead against it. Even the glass seemed hot. Her apron brushed the pots of red geraniums crowding the wide sill. They were flourishing in this hot house. She coughed, trying to free her throat and lungs for breath. Then she felt, rather than saw, Diana. "Mr. Marsden has his eye on you," the older girl said gently, and put her arm on Lyddie's shoulder to turn her back toward the looms. She pointed to the stalled loom and the broken warp thread that must be tied. Even though Diana had stopped the loom, Lyddie stood rubbing the powder into her fingertips, hesitating to plunge her hands into the bowels of the machine. Diana urged her with a light touch. "I stared down a black bear," Lyddie reminded herself. She took a deep breath, fished out the broken ends, and began to tie the weaver's knot that Diana had shown her over and over again the afternoon before. Finally, Lyddie managed to make a clumsy knot, and Diana pulled the lever, and the loom shuddered to life once more. How could she ever get accustomed to this inferno? Even when the girls were set free at 7, it was to push and shove their way across the bridge and down the street to their boarding houses, bolt down their hearty breakfast, and rush back, stomachs still churning, for ring-in at 7:35. Nearly half the mealtime was spent simply going up and down the staircase, across the mill yard and bridge, down the row of houses, just getting to and from the meal. And the din in the dining room was nearly as loud as the racket in the mill. 30 young women chewing and calling at the same time, reaching for the platters of flapjacks and pitchers of syrup, ignoring cries from the other end of the table to pass anything. Her quiet meals in the corner of the kitchen with Tryphena, even her meager bowls of bark soup in the cabin with the seldom talkative Charlie, seemed like feasts compared to the huge, rushed, noisy affairs in Miss Bedloe's house. The half-hour at noonday dinner with more food than she ever had set before her at one time was worse than breakfast. At last the evening bell rang, and Mr. Marsden pulled the cord to end the day. Diana walked with her to the place by the door where the girls hung their bonnets and shawls, and handed Lyddie hers. "Let's forget about studying those regulations tonight," she said. "It's been too long a day already." Lyddie nodded. Yesterday seemed years in the past. She couldn't even remember why she'd thought the regulations important enough to bother with. She had lost all appetite. The very smell of supper made her nauseous. Beans, heavy with pork fat, and brown Injun bread with orange cheese, fried potatoes, of course, and flapjacks with applesauce, baked Indian pudding with cream, and plum cake for dessert. Lyddie nibbled at the brown bread and washed it down with a little scalding tea. How could the others eat so heartily and with such a clatter of dishes and shrieks of conversation? She longed only to get to the room, take off her boots, massage her abused feet, and lay down her aching head. While the other girls pulled their chairs from the table and scraped them about to form little circles in the parlor area, Lyddie dragged herself from the table and up the stairs. Betsy was already there before her, her current novel in her hand. She laughed at the sight of Lyddie. The first full day, and up to now you thought yourself a strapping country farm girl who could do anything, didn't you? Lyddie did not try to answer back. She simply sank to her side of the double bed and took off the offending shoes and began to rub her swollen feet. If you've got an older pair, Betsy's voice was almost gentle, more stretched and softer. Lyddie nodded. Tomorrow she'd wear Tryphenas without the stuffing. They were still stiff from the trip, and she'd be awkward rushing back and forth to meals, but at least there'd be room for her feet to swell. She undressed, slipped on her shabby night shift, and slid under the quilt. Betsy glanced over at her. To bed so soon? Lyddie could only nod again. It was as though she could not possibly squeeze a word through her lips. Betsy smiled again. She ain't laughing at me, Lyddie realized. She's remembering how it was. Shall I read to you? Betsy asked. Lyddie nodded gratefully and closed her eyes and turned her back against the candlelight. Betsy did not give any explanation of the novel she was reading, simply commenced to read aloud what she had broken off reading to herself. Even though Lyddie's head was still choked with lint and battered with noise, she struggled to get the sense of the story. The child was in some kind of poorhouse, it seemed, and he was hungry. Lyddie knew about hungry children. Rachel, Agnes, Charlie, they had all been hungry that winter of the bear. The hungry little boy in the story had held up his bowl to the poorhouse overseer and said, "Please, sir, I want some more." And for this the overseer, she could see his little rosebud mouth rounded in horror. For this the overseer had screamed out at the child. In her mind's eye, little Oliver Twist looked exactly like a younger Charlie. The cruel overseer had screamed and hauled the boy before a sort of agent. And for what crime? For the monstrous crime of wanting more to eat? That boy will be hung, the agent had prophesied. I know what that boy will be hung. She fought sleep, ravenous for every word. She had not had any appetite for the bountiful meal downstairs, but now she was feeling a hunger she knew nothing about. She had to know what would happen to little Oliver. Would he indeed be hanged just because he wanted more gruel? She opened her eyes and turned to watch Betsy, who was absorbed in her reading. Then Betsy sensed her watching and looked up from the book. "It's a marvelous story, isn't it? I saw the author once, Mr. Charles Dickens. He visited our factory. Let me see. I was already in the spinning room. It must have been in—" But Lyddie cared nothing for authors or dates. "Don't stop reading the story, please," she croaked out. "Never fear, little Lyddie. No more interruptions," Betsy promised, and read on, though her voice grew raspy with fatigue, until the bell rang for curfew. She stuck a hair ribbon in the place. "Till tomorrow night," she whispered, as the feet of an army of girls could be heard thundering up the staircase. Chapter 11. The Admirable Choice. The next day in the mill the noise was just as jarring, and her feet in Tryphena's old boots swelled just as large, but now and again she caught herself humming, "Why am I suddenly happy? What wonderful thing is about to happen to me?" And then she remembered. Tonight after supper Betsy would read to her again. She was, of course, afraid for Oliver, who was all mixed up in her mind with Charlie, but there was a delicious anticipation, like molded sugar on her tongue. She had to know what would happen to him, how his story would unfold. Diana noticed the change. "You're settling in faster than I thought," she said, but Lyddie didn't tell her. She didn't quite know how to explain to anyone that it wasn't so much that she had gotten used to the mill, but she had found a way to escape its grasp. The pasted sheets of poetry or scripture in the window frames, the geraniums on the sill, those must be some other girl's way, she decided, but hers was a story. As the days melted into weeks, she tried not to think how very kind it was of Betsy to keep reading to her. There were nights, of course, when she could not, when there was shopping or washing that had to be done. On Saturday evenings they were let out 2 hours early, and Amelia corralled Lyddie and Prudence for long walks along the river before it grew too dark. Betsy, of course, did whatever she liked, regardless of Amelia. Sundays Amelia dragged the reluctant Lyddie to church. At first Lyddie had been afraid Betsy would go on reading without her, but Betsy waited until Sunday afternoon, when Amelia and Prudence were down in the dining room writing their weekly letters home, and she picked up the story just where she had stopped on the previous Friday evening. It was several weeks before Lyddie caught on that the novel was from the lending library, and thus cost Betsy 5 cents a week to borrow. On her own, Betsy could have read it much faster. Lyddie was sure of that. As much as she hated to spend the money on her first payday, Lyddie insisted on giving Betsy a full 10 cents to help with Oliver's rent. Betsy laughed, but she took it. She too was saving her money, she confessed quietly to Lyddie and asked her not to tell, to go for an education. There was a college out west in Ohio that took female students, a real college, not a young ladies' seminary. But don't tell Amelia, she said, her voice returning to its usual ironic tone. She'd think it unladylike to want to go to Oberlin. It seemed strange to Lyddie that Betsy should care at all what Amelia thought, but Lyddie, who had never had any ambition to be thought a lady, did find herself asking, what would Amelia think, and censoring her own behavior from time to time accordingly. Then, all too soon, the book was done. It seemed to have flown by, and there was so much, especially at the beginning, when Lyddie was too tired and try as she might could not listen properly, so much at the beginning that she needed to hear again. Actually, she needed to hear the whole book again, even the terrible parts, dear Nancy's killing and the death of Sykes. She wished she dared to ask Betsy to read more, but she could not. Betsy had given her hours and hours of time and voice, and besides, with July nearly upon them, the three roommates were making plans for going home. The very word was like a blow to her chest. Home. If only she could go. But she had signed with the corporation for a full year of work. If she left, even just to see the cabin and visit for an hour or so with Charlie, she would lose her position. And if you leave without an honorable discharge, the clerk had said, not only will you never work at the Concord Corporation again, but no other mill in Lowell will ever engage you. Blacklisted. The word sent chills down her backbone. So she watched her roommates pack their trunks and listened as they chattered about whom they would see and what they would do, and tried not to mind. Amelia would go to New Hampshire, where her clergyman father had a country church. Her mother would welcome her help around the manse and with the tutoring of the farm children in the parish Sunday school. Prudence was bound for the family farm near Rutland, where, Amelia hinted, a suitor on a neighboring farm was primed to snatch her away from factory life forever. Betsy's parents were dead, but there was an uncle in Maine who was always glad for her to come and help with the cooking. Haying season would soon be here, and there would be many mouths to feed. There was a chance as well, Betsy said, of seeing her brother, but again he might be too pressed with invitations from his university mates to find time for a visit with a sister who is only an old spinster and a factory girl to boot. After they are gone, I will be earning and saving, Lyddie said to comfort herself. I may earn even more. If the weaving room is short of workers, Mr. Marsden may assign me another loom. Then I could turn out many more pieces each week, for she was proficient now. Weeks before, she had begun tending her own loom without Diana's help. She hadn't imagined that Diana would go on holiday as well, but when Diana told her she was going, she felt a little thrill. Mr. Marsden was sure to give her charge of at least 2 looms, perhaps a third. She didn't want Diana to think she was rejoicing in her absence, but she was not skilled at feigning feelings she did not own. I'll miss you, she said. Diana laughed at her. Oh, you'll be glad enough to see me gone, she said. There'll be 3 looms for you to tend, a nice fat raise to your wages for these several weeks. Lyddie blushed. You needn't feel bad. Enjoy the money. I think you'll find you've earned every penny. It's hot as Hades up here in July. But where will you be going? Lyddie asked, trying to shift attention from herself. She quickly repented, remembering too late that Diana had no family waiting to see her. It's all right, Diana said in reply to Lyddie's pained look. I was orphaned young. I'm used to it. I suppose this mill is as much as home as I can claim. I started here as a doffer when I was 10, so I've 15 years here, but only a scant handful of Julys. Lyddie wanted to ask, then, if she had no home to go to, where she was headed, but it wasn't rightly her business, and Diana didn't offer the information except to say when the noise of the machines ensured that no one could overhear. There'll be a mass meeting at Woburn on Independence Day. When Lyddie looked puzzled, she went on, of the movement, the 10-hour movement. Miss Bagley will speak, as well as some of the men. When Lyddie still said nothing, she continued, There'll be a picnic lunch, a real 4th of July celebration. How about it? I promise no one will make you sign your name to anything. Lyddie pressed her lips together and shook her head. No, she said. I expect I'll be busy. July was hot, as Diana had so inelegantly predicted. Reluctantly, Lyddie spent $1 on a light summer work dress, as her spring calico proved unbearable. Her other expenditure was at the lending library, where she borrowed Oliver Twist. This time she would read it on her own. It didn't occur to her that she was teaching herself as she laboriously chopped apart the words that had rolled like rainwater off Betsy's tongue. She was so hungry to hear the story again that, exhausted as she was after her 13 hours in the weaving room, she lay sweating across her bed, mouthing in whispers the sounds of Mr. Dickinson's narrative. She was grateful to be alone in the room. There was no one there to make fun of her efforts or even to try to help. She didn't want help. She didn't want to share this reading with anyone. She was determined to learn the book so well that she would be able to read it aloud to Charlie some day, and wouldn't he be surprised? His Lyddie a real scholar? He'd be monstrous proud. During the day at the loom, she went over in her head the bits of the story that she had puzzled out the night before. Then it occurred to her that she could copy out pages and paste them up and practice reading them whenever she had a pause. There were not a lot of pauses when she had 3 machines to tend, so she pasted the copied page on the frame of one of the looms where she could snatch a glance at it as she worked. July was halfway gone when she made her momentous decision. One fair evening, as soon as supper was done, she dressed in her calico, which was nicer than her light summer cotton, put on her bonnet and good boots, and went out on the street. She was trembling when she got to the door of the shop, but she pushed it open. A little bell rang as she did so, and a gentleman who was seated on a high stool behind a slanting desktop looked up at her over his spectacles. "How may I help you, miss?" he asked politely. She tried to control the shaking in her voice, but in the end was unable to. I come to purchase the book," she said. The gentleman slid off his stool and waited for her to continue, but Lyddie had already made her rehearsed speech. She didn't have any more words prepared. Finally, he leaned toward her and said in the kindliest sort of voice, "What book did you have in mind, my dear?" How stupid she must seem to him! The shop was nothing but shelves and shelves of books, hundreds, perhaps thousands of books. Oliver Twist, if you please, sir," she managed to stammer out. "Ah," he said, "Mr. Dickens, an admirable choice." He showed her several editions, some rudely printed on cheap paper with only paper backing, but there was only one she wanted. It was beautifully bound in leather, with gold letters stamped on its spine. It would take all her money, she knew. Maybe it would be more than she had. She looked fearfully at the kind clerk. "That'll be $2, he said. "Shall I wrap it for you?" She handed him $2 silver from her purse. "Yes," she said, sighing with relief. "Yes, thank you, sir." And clutching her treasure, she ran from the shop and would have run all the way back to the boarding house, except that she realized that people on the street were turning to stare. The Sundays of July were too precious to think of going to church. She didn't even go to the big Sunday school union picnic on the 4th, though the sound of the fireworks sent her running from her room to the kitchen. There was no one at home to explain the fearsome racket, but she satisfied herself that the iron cook stove had not blown up, and returned to her sweltering bedroom to continue reading and copying. Miss Bedloe gave a general reminder at breakfast on the third Sabbath that many of her boarders were neglecting divine worship, and that the corporation would be most vexed if attendance did not soon improve among the inhabitants of number 5. Lyddie slipped the copied page of her book into her pocket and managed to read through the long Methodist sermon. In this way, she only lost a little study time during the 2-hour service. She was startled once into attention during the scripture reading. "Why do you, a Jew, ask water of me, a Samaritan?" the woman asked Jesus in the gospel story. Jesus a Jew? Just like the wicked Fagin? No one had ever told her that Jesus was a Jew before, just like Fagin, and yet not like Fagin at all. Lyddie studied on it as she walked home after the service. "Will you watch where you're going, please?" She had walked straight into a stout woman in her Sunday best. Lyddie murmured an apology, but the woman humphed angrily and readjusted her bonnet, mumbling something under her breath that ended in "factory girls." The sidewalk was too crowded for daydreaming. Lyddie packed her wonderings away in her head to think about some other time and began to watch where she was going. It was then that she saw Diana, or thought she did. At any rate, she saw a couple, a handsome, bearded gentleman with a well-dressed lady on his arm, walking toward her on the opposite side of Merrimack Street. The woman was Diana. Lyddie was sure of it. Without thinking, Lyddie called out to her, but the woman turned her head away. Perhaps she was embarrassed to have a girl yelling rudely at her across a public thoroughfare. Then several carriages and a cart rolled past them, and before Lyddie could see them again, the man and woman had disappeared into the crowd of Sunday strollers. She must have been mistaken. Diana would have recognized her and come across to speak. Chapter 12. I Will Not Be a Slave. She was good at her work, fast, nimble-fingered, diligent, and even in the nearly unbearable heat of the weaving room, apparently indefatigable. The overseer noticed from his high corner stool. Lyddie saw him watching, and she could tell by the smile on his little round lips that he was pleased with her. One afternoon, a pair of foreign dignitaries toured the mill, and Mr. Marsden brought them over to watch Lyddie work. She tried to smile politely, but she felt like a prize sow at a village auction. They didn't pause long. One of them spent the whole time mopping his face and neck and muttering foreign phrases which Lyddie was sure had to do with the temperature rather than the marvels of the conquered corporation. The other stood by blinking the perspiration from his eyes, looking as though he might faint at any moment. "One of our best girls," Mr. Marsden said, beaming. "One of our very best." The pay reflected her proficiency. She was making almost $2.50 a week above her $1.75 board. While the other girls grumbled that their piece rates had dropped so that it had hardly been worth slaving through the summer heat, she kept her silence. With Diana gone, she had no friends in the weaving room. She worked too hard to waste precious time getting a drink at the water bucket or running out to the staircase to snatch a breath of air. Besides, her Oliver was pasted up, and any free moment her eyes went to the text. She read and reread the page for the day until she nearly had the words by heart. In this way, she found that even the words that had seemed impossible to decipher on first reading began to make sense as she discovered their place in the story. The names, though peculiar, were the easiest because she remembered them well from Betsy's reading. She liked the names Mr. Bumble, a villain, but like her bear, a clumsy one. You had to laugh at his attempts to be somebody in a world that obviously despised him. Bill Sykes, a name like a rapier, a real villain, with nothing to dilute the evil of him, not even Nancy's love. She did not ask herself how a woman could stay with a man like Sykes. Even in her short life she had known of women who clung to fearsome husbands. Fagin she understood a bit. If the world despised you so much, you were apt to seek revenge on it. The boy thieves, what choice did they have with no homes or families, only workhouses that pretended Christian charity and dealt out despair? She knew with a shudder how close the family had come to being on the mercy of the town that winter her mother had fled with the babies. Was it to save them from the poor farm that she had gone? Lyddie had not thought of it that way before. Her mother might have realized that she and Charlie on their own were stout enough to manage, but with the extra burden of their mother and the babies. Had their mother really thought the bear was the devil on earth? Had she really thought the end was near? Lyddie wondered if she'd ever know the truth of that, any more than she would ever know what had become of their father. A letter came to number 5 in her mother's handwriting. Lyddie felt a pang as she ran to fetch the coins to reimburse Miss Bedloe for the postage. She hadn't yet sent any money to her mother. She'd been meaning to. She even had a few dollars set aside for the purpose. But her head had been tied up in other things, her work, the boarding house, the dream world of a book, and she had neglected the poor who were her own flesh. She wanted not to have to open the letter. She wanted the letter never to have arrived. But there it was, and it had to be faced. Dear daughter, I was exceeding surprised to get your letter concern your move to Lowell. I do not know to say. If you can send money, it will be help to Judah and Clarissa. They feel a great burden. Baby Agnes is gone to God. Rachel is poorly. Many have died, but God's will be done. Your loving mother, Mattie M. Worthen. She tried to remember Agnes's little face. She strained, squinching her eyes tight to get a picture of her sister, now gone forever. She was a baby. She couldn't have been more than 4 the winter of the bear, but that was now nearly 2 years past. She would have changed. Maybe she didn't even remember me, Lyddie thought. Could she have forgotten me and Charlie? Me, Lyddie, who washed and fed her, and dear Charlie, who made her laugh. She wanted to cry, but no tears came, only a hard, dry knot in the place where her heart should have been. She must work harder. She must earn all the money to pay what they owed so she could gather her family together back on the farm while she still had family left to gather. The idea of living alone and orphaned and without brother or sister, a life barren of land and family like Diana's. So it was that when the Concord Corporation once again speeded up the machinery, she, almost alone, did not complain. She only had 2 looms to tend instead of the 4 she'd tended during the summer. She needed the money. She had to have the money. Some of the girls had no sooner come back from their summer holidays than they went home again. They could not keep up the pace. Lyddie was given another loom and then another, and even at the increased speed of each loom, she could tend all 4 and felt a satisfying disdain for those who could not do the work. Prudence was the first of the roommates to go home for good. The suitor in Rutland was urging her to give up factory life, but there was a more compelling reason for her to return. She had begun coughing, a dry, painful cough through the night that kept both Betsy and Amelia awake, though not Lyddie. She slept like a caterpillar in winter. Indeed, she was cocooned from all the rest. Betsy had not offered to read another novel to Lyddie since the summer. She and several other operatives had formed study groups, one in Latin and another in botany. On Tuesday and Thursday evenings, they commandeered half the parlor of number 5 and hired their own teacher. When Betsy wasn't downstairs with her group, she was in the room preparing for her next session. Would you like me to read the text to you? She asked Lyddie once, taking her nose out from between the pages of her botany book. Lyddie smiled and shook her head. She knew about plants and flowers at least as much as she craved to know. She didn't know enough about Oliver Twist. With Prudence gone and the parlor congested, Amelia was often in the room. She insisted on talking, though Betsy, when there, ignored her, and Lyddie tried hard to. The 2 of you should be exercising your bodies instead of holding up in this stuffy room reading, Amelia said. No answer. Or at the least stretching your souls. No reply, though both Lyddie and Betsy knew that Amelia was reminding them that it was the Sabbath, and neither of them had gone to services earlier. What are you reading, Lyddie? Maybe if I pretend not to hear, she'll leave me be. Lyddie! This time she spoke so sharply that Lyddie looked up startled. Get your nose out of that book and come take a walk with me. We won't have many more lovely Sunday afternoons like this. It will be getting cold soon. I'm busy, Lyddie mumbled. Amelia came closer. You've been reading that same book for months. She reached over and took Oliver Twist out of Lyddie's hands. That's my book, eh? Come on, Lyddie. Just a short walk by the river before supper. It will do you good. "Will you get her out of here before I gag her with my bonnet ribbons and lash her to the bedpost?" Betsy said tightly, never taking her eyes off her own book. "She can walk by herself. I got to read my book." Lyddie stretched her hand to take the book back, but Amelia held it up just out of reach. "Oh, come," she said. "You've already read this book. I've seen you. And besides, it's only a silly novel, not fit for reading and a sin on the Sabbath." Lyddie could feel the gorge rising in her throat. Silly novel? It was life and death. "You ain't read it," she said, forgetting her grammar in her anger. "How can you know?" Amelia flushed and her eyes blinked rapidly. She was no longer teasing. "I know about novels," she said, her voice high and a little shaky. "They are the devil's instrument to draw impressionable young minds to perdition." Lyddie stared at Amelia with her mouth wide open. It was Betsy who spoke. "For pity's sake, Amelia, where did you ever hear such pompous nonsense?" Amelia's face grew redder. "You are unbelievers and scoffers, and I don't see how I can continue to live in the same room with you." "Oh, hush." Betsy's tones were gentler than her words. "We do you no harm. Can't we just live and let live?" Amelia began to cry. Her chiseled marble features crumbled into the angry, helpless rage of a child. As Lyddie watched, she could feel the hardness inside herself breaking, like jagged cracks across granite. She got a clean handkerchief from her own box and handed it to the older girl. "Here," she said. Amelia glanced quickly at the hanky, making sure it was a clean one. Lyddie thought wryly, but she murmured a thank you and blew her nose. "I don't know what possessed me," she said, more in her old tone. "We're all working like black slaves is what," said Betsy. "I've half a mind to sign the blooming petition." "Oh, Betsy, you wouldn't!" Amelia lifted her nose out of the handkerchief, her eyes wide. "Wouldn't I just? When I started in the spinning room, I could do a 13-hour day and to spare, but in those days I had 130 spindles to tend. Now I've twice that many at a speed that would make the devil curse. I'm worn out, Amelia. We're all worn out. But we'd be paid less. Couldn't Betsy understand that? If we just worked 10 hours, we'd be paid much less." "Time is more precious than money, Lyddie girl. If only I had 2 more free hours of an evening, what I couldn't do." "Should you sign the petition, Betsy, they'll dismiss you. I know they will." Amelia folded the handkerchief and handed it back to Lyddie with a nod. "And would you miss me, Amelia? I thought you'd consider it good riddance. I thought I was the blister on your heel these last 4 years. I'm thinking of you. What will you do with no job? You'd be blacklisted. No other corporation would hire you." "Oh," said Betsy, "maybe I'd just take off west. I've nearly the money." She smiled slyly at Lyddie. "I'm thinking of going out to Ohio." "Ohio?" "Hurrah!" Betsy cried out. "That's it. I wait till I've got all the money I need, sign the petition, and exit this city of spindles in a veritable fireworks of defiance." "No!" Lyddie was startled herself that she had spoken so sharply. Both girls looked at her. "I mean, please, don't sign. I can't. I gotta have the money. I gotta pay the debts before—" "Oh, Lyddie, hasn't your friend Diana explained it all to you? We're working longer hours, tending more machines, all of which have been speeded to demon pace so the corporation can make a packet of money. Our real wages have gone down more often than they've gone up. Merciful heaven, why waste our time on a paper petition? Why not a good old-fashioned turnout?" Betsy put her botany book on the counterpane face down to save the place, hugged her knees, and began to sing in a high, childlike soprano. "Oh, isn't it a pity such a pretty girl as I should be sent to the factory to pine away and die? Oh, I cannot be a slave. I will not be a slave, for I'm so fond of liberty that I cannot be a slave." "I ain't a slave," said Lyddie fiercely. "I ain't a slave." "Of course you aren't." Amelia's confidence had returned, and with it her schoolmarm manner. "At the inn I worked sometimes 15, 16 hours a day, and they paid my mother 50 cents a week if they remembered. Here." "Oh, shush, girl. Nobody's calling you a slave. I was just singing the old song." "How do you know that radical song?" Amelia asked. "I was a doffer back in '36. At 10 you learn all the songs. And did you join the turnout?" Now Amelia looked like a schoolmarm who had caught a child in mischief. Betsy's eyes blazed. "At 10, I let out my whole floor, running all the way. It was the most exciting day of my life." "It does no good to rebel against authority." "Well, it does me good. I'm sick of being a sniveling wage slave." Betsy picked up her botany book again as though closing the discussion. "I mean, it's unladylike and against the scriptures." Amelia's voice was shaking as she spoke. "Against the Bible to fight injustice? Oh, come now, Amelia. I think you've got the wrong book at that church of yours." Lyddie looked from one angry face to the other. She cared nothing for being a lady or being religious. She was making far more money than she ever had at home in Vermont, or was ever likely to. Why couldn't people just live and let live? The clang of the curfew bell quieted the argument, but not Lyddie's anxiety.